All right, all yours.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the vSphere provider for the meeting for the vSphere provider for the cluster API bi-weekly meeting. This is a public meeting, and I guess we should go ahead and get started. Let me share my screen. Today is going to be a shorter meeting. A lot of people, at least on the VMware side, are on PTO, and not sure that they will join today. But if they do, then that'll be good. But and also the agenda I have is not that long today. So why don't I share my screen? Just looking for it here. So before we start, we have a new member on the call today, and he's not from VMware. Marco, do you want to introduce yourself to the rest of the meeting?
Yes, hello, I'm Marco. I'm new here, first time attending the meeting. I'm working from Woods. We are working on the cluster API stuff and provisioning the clusters and so on. I'm interested in how the cluster vSphere API provider works. Can we contribute to it, and what's the plans for the future for now? And I'm interested about transiting from Terraform to Go API, and I wanted to learn more about that.
Okay, welcome. We're glad to have you, and we could use help if you're willing to provide a hand to us. So here's the agenda that I laid out. The way that this works is that Marco, if you haven't been to these meetings yet, or is you can modify this document and add to the agenda whenever you want. And then we talk about it at the meetings. And right now I only have three agenda. The third one is going to be will be a longer one, so I'll talk about that. But while we're going through this agenda, if you want to add any more items to this list, go ahead and do that. Okay, so the first agenda item is the switch from Terraform to vSphere. I should say to Go vMami. I've gotten the okay from Google. They were the one that wrote the original cluster API provider for vSphere, and they use Terraform. And the word I got from them is that that was just an example provider to help bootstrap the cluster API itself, and it was more of a proof of concept, and they really don't have any stake in it. So we're going to go ahead and proceed with that work. Any comments, Marco? I assume, Marco, that you might want to participate in contributing to this.
Yes. So that sounds good. That's what I'm interested in. Switching to the Go API would be better for the Terraform. Maybe easier to handle some stuff, and it's following the cluster API, other cluster APIs providers. So I think it's okay.
Okay. It looks like we just added another member. Okay, he just dropped off. Okay, so why don't we move on to the next issue? So I kind of signed up VMware to work on this pluggable bootstrap workflow. So the idea is that, you know, currently today, the cluster API to create, to deploy, to create clusters, it has to create this bootstrap cluster. And then from that bootstrap cluster, it creates the actual target cluster, and then it pivots over. And that's a workflow that I believe in, and a few other people in the some of the product team also believe that it's a good workflow for developers, but most of our customers are VI admins, and they want to have some sort of source of truth that they can access. And the pattern that a lot of VMware products have used is installing an OVA, and that we could install an OVA that has either an OVA or VCSA agent that has the Bootstrap cluster already. So, and then from there, the developers or the users can then create their clusters if they want. And so the idea of this was, how do we make this this workflow? That's the way that VMware has traditionally patterned this sort of the deployment model. But other providers may have a different model for how they deploy this Bootstrap cluster the best for their infrastructure. So this work is just basically how can we make this portion flexible enough that people can just plug in their model of bootstrapping. So I signed us up for that. Okay, so let's get to the meat of this meeting. So I worked with two other teams in our company, product teams, to start laying out start brainstorming on ideas on features that we can implement before the end of the year and beyond for the provider, for the vSphere provider, and also for the cluster control. Just to explain what I mean by the cluster control. The cluster control now, it's up to the individual provider to build. So we have control over that ACLI, or we can also create a new one. And so I sat down with these two other teams, and we started brainstorming an initial brainstorm of feature sets that we can add to make this a more robust solution for administrators and for customers that use vSphere. And I have a document. It's not shared right now, but I'm in the process right now of transferring all of those issues into GitHub. So you can see here, these are labeled feature. I'm not sure what the standard for adding feature requests are, but I'm adding GitHub issues for new features that we want to support in the long run. And I thought that right now we can go over the ones that I have created so far. Now, all these features are not destined for the end of the year, but these are features that we can want to do in the future. And some of these issues may actually end up being an epic and not just a one issue. And when I go over some of these issues, you'll understand why. So the first one was support Windows node. Kubernetes support on Windows for Windows containers are coming. And when that is available, we want to be able to support Windows container, Windows pods, Windows node. So I could see this being an epic. And right now, this issue has just this one sentence, but I could see this issue being converted to an epic and having multiple issues underneath of it. The next one that we want to support, new feature, is device support. So device support are something like, for instance, multiple NICs or GPU support. So there's something that's moving through SIG node right now called resource class. It's not, it hasn't been approved yet, but I think that it will be. And when that is supported, when that goes through, then I think we need to support that too, especially for GPU support. Now, I'm not sure exactly what this means for the cluster API. I really don't know, but we should be prepared for it. The next one is something that's close to me, isolated pod support. So just to let people on this meeting know, I worked on a container runtime for vSphere. So, isolated container, isolated pods or something, and container runtime is something I really know. And there is a proposal right now for something called runtime class. So this given a pod spec, if you specify a runtime class, instead of running the containers of the pod on the host, they would isolate the pod in some kind of isolation unit, like a VM or something like a gvisor, much lighter weight isolation unit. And there could also be other methods of supporting runtime class outside of runtime class. So that is something VMware definitely wants to support. Okay, custom cloud init script. So currently, the cloud init scripts are hard-coded in the template.go file in the vSphere provider, and that can be a default, but we would like to be able to allow administrators or users, developers, to pass in their own. There may be times when they would want to pass in their own custom cloud init script. And this is the issue for that.
Is there some plan? Do we want to follow upstream on that one? For example, Google Cloud does that by creating a config map with a cloud init script and allowing it to provide it in the provider template or machine template, or are we planning on something a little bit different than upstream?
We don't really have that defined of how we're going to support it yet. If you have ideas, I welcome you to add a comment. Or if you can, I'm not sure if you can edit the issue or not, but if you want to, you can edit the issue and add your own comments.
Okay.
We welcome any ideas, seriously. The next item is that we want to support vSAN. I think that's kind of self-serving for us. We have vSAN and we want to be able to support it. That's all this issue is. So this next issue is to give, and I debated on whether I should write up this issue inside of this repo or inside the main repo. But I went ahead and wrote it up inside this repo. So right now, cluster control, you can create and delete clusters. And you can create multiple clusters. But once you create multiple clusters, there's no way to query what clusters do I have that I created. And there's no way for me to say, like, let's say I created cluster staging cluster. There's no way for me to say, describe this cluster to me. So if, for instance, I deploy these cluster with a bunch of YAML files, and my hard drive crashed and I no longer have the YAML files. It would be nice to be able for cluster control to be able to describe this cluster I deployed, I created. So that's what this issue is. The next one is a feature to persist the bootstrap cluster config in the event of crash. So let me explain why the bootstrap cluster. In the event, in the scenario that I described earlier where we have an OVA. We deploy the Bootstrap cluster using an OVA. And that cluster is meant to stick around. It may not stick around, but if this is the design of it, where it sticks around. And then we start deploying target cluster using this Bootstrap cluster. And for some reason, this Bootstrap cluster crashes or gets corrupted somehow. If we don't have a way to recover that Bootstrap cluster, then those other target clusters are just sitting out there, and the user may not be able to figure out what cluster exists out there, or update the clusters, or do anything else with the target cluster. So if we persist the Bootstrap cluster config, then perhaps we can recover that Bootstrap cluster in some way, right? So you can deploy the Bootstrap cluster again, and it sees that, oh, wait, I have configuration for an existing Bootstrap cluster. Let me use that config and recreate the Bootstrap cluster. Okay, so that's that issue. And the last one I wrote down. Now there are more that I'm adding, but this last one that I had written up is a backup and recovery of the cluster config. So define, design, and implement a backup recovery approach for the cluster config. And this is most likely just the etcd database. The previous issue that I mentioned, where we have a way to recover the Bootstrap cluster because we persisted the configuration. This issue is about how do we back up and recover the config, an approach to doing that. Okay. Any questions so far on any of these issues?
No, not at all.
Okay. So,
hey, Locke.
Yeah.
Sorry, hey, Locke.
Hey, Siddharth.
Sorry, I joined late. Thanks for being here. I
fine.
completely missed it. So just the cluster config here that you're mentioning, just to be clear, this is for the individual clusters that have been created, right?
Well, I think it's for it should be both, right? The target clusters and the Bootstrap cluster, right? If you don't back up the Bootstrap cluster config and your Bootstrap cluster crashes, you won't, and that those configs gone, you won't be able to recreate the cluster, rehydrate the cluster.
Right. So essentially, when you say like so at least when it comes to the target cluster, that's pretty clear. But when I think about, let's say, the Bootstrap cluster that was initially responsible for creating all of these, and especially when you think about the config, like what exactly, can you maybe give me an example, like what might comprise of that config?
That's a good question, and I don't really want to go into the details in this meeting. If you have questions, and we can have I wrote up these issues, and we can have the conversations on these in GitHub.
Sure.
Okay.
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I just meant, since you wrote, if you had anything specific in mind, but that's okay. We can definitely.
No, I don't really. The details. When we had the meeting between you, me, and Farhan, we were just brainstorming, right?
Okay.
The details of the design and it's something that we tried not to do in that meeting, and I think it's up to whoever takes on this issue to help define that.
Sure.
Okay. So just to give everybody on the Zoom, here are a couple other items that we've been brainstorming on. These are things that I need to transfer over to GitHub. Now, and I'll do that before the end of the day. Now, I want to state that there are a lot of issues that were features that we're writing up, and I think I said earlier in this call that not all of them are targeted and can be done by the end of the year, and there's no timeline set for that. Once we get past the alpha release of Cluster API, which is targeted for this next upcoming Kubernetes release, then we'll start picking out the feature set that we believe that we can accomplish for the next quarter, and then we'll put that into an epic. Okay. So Marco and anybody else on the call, I invite you guys, if you have any ideas or feature requests, to go ahead and add those to GitHub. I engage with some of the product teams in the company to try to come up with an initial list. But if we continue talking, we could come up with an even longer list. And we invite any suggestions that anybody in the community may have. With that, unless there's any other issue, comments, or questions, I think that's the end of this week's meeting. Does anybody have any comments?
Nothing from my side for now.
Okay. It looks like we have another person that I do not recognize. Would you like to introduce yourself? Yuridar?
Hey, hi.
Hi.
I'm part of the Telco NFE group as well. I'm on the same team as Siddharth. So.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought that you might have been somebody outside of VMware.
No. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. With that, if there's nothing else, I think we can adjourn this meeting, and then we'll meet back in 2 weeks when more people are back online. Okay.
Hey, Lux, I was just looking through. I'm sorry, I kind of missed the first 15 minutes of the meeting, so I'm really sorry if I will repeat or.
No, go ahead. We have time.
Okay, so I just looking at the features that you added in the issues. First of all, thanks a lot for adding that. That's really good for us to start tracking things. One thing that I don't see here, I mean, can like adding multiple NICs, for example. I mean, I can go and add, or if you want, you can.
So yeah, so I kind of touched on that.
Oh, okay.
So this device support.
Oh, I see.
So there's a new proposal going through SIG right now called Resource Class, and it's designed to support devices, low-level devices, so multiple NICs and GPU, etc. That's just at the, I believe, I'm not sure how far that goes, whether it's just at the lowest level, or does it, what else we need to do above just exposing that to the Kubernetes cluster.
So that's part of the SIG node. So that would be essentially, okay. So this is more of, if I remember correctly, or if I understand correctly, this was more that when you have a Kubernetes node, there's a mechanism to say discover devices and capabilities on that node, and this is probably part of that to support like a number of different devices, probably. Now, I mean, so one is, I mean, that is at the node level, but essentially, have you seen, for example, any proposal where, how would you model that? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, being at the cluster API level, at the level which is going to provision the cluster, you should be able to express what sort of devices you want in that machine, right? Yes, they will ultimately go and get recognized as, again, set of device support as part of the node as well. But from the cluster API point of view, because this is the orchestration layer, which is actually creating these VMs. So we probably have to think about how do we express these.
I see what you're saying. So this is before this, what you're describing is adding device support before resource class actually
hits in.
I see. Yeah, I think that would be a separate issue then. This issue was about resource class, but you're absolutely right. When we're constructing the VM, we need to be able to. That's completely separate. So, if you want to go ahead and write up the issue, I could write up the issue.
Sure. I mean, I can add that. So maybe let's just to. So what at least I was thinking is, given that the current way of representing all of these things is, for example, for a machine is the machine.yaml, right? Literally the machine YAML description that we have today, which describes what today it's literally a flat list of key value pairs.
Yeah.
But I think we probably might have to make it a little bit more structured. I mean, kind of in parallel to, let's say, if you were to take a look at just the vSphere APIs today, and see when you do a create VM, what kind of things, it's a structured information at that point in time, right? It has let's say, collection of devices, different devices, and so on and so forth. We don't have to necessarily go into that level of detail as a VM, because we're not trying to replicate exactly a VM spec here, at that level at least. But for the things that we do care and the things that are going to be imminent here, like for example, GPU is also one good example here, right? I mean, because if you want, let's say, your VM to have a GPU, you need to, when you do a create VM on the vSphere infrastructure, that call has to have that input, as in, okay, I need a GPU device as an additional device in the VM spec, right? Because it's only after that then the rest of the things will follow through. So given that, maybe we can come up with a little bit more structured approach to laying out a definition of a machine. Now, one of my question is now, do you know if the definition of the machine as it exists today in the upstream cluster API, like the provider agnostic version of the machine definition, right? Like, do you think we need to push this structured definition somewhere at that level, or should we only at our provider layer?
I think that it would be nice to push that up to that level, but I think with a lot of this stuff, features like this, it starts at the provider specific level first, and then and then at that point, once we get that working, we can push it up to the.
Okay, I see.
To the main repo, but I think that we're quite a ways from actually looking at least for GPU. I think for your product, maybe multiple NICs might be more important, and maybe we do start working on that for your team.
Yes, yeah. I mean, definitely. I mean, actually, you're right. I mean, at least for the purposes for my consumption or my team's consumption of the cluster API, we definitely would need to have at least the option to support multiple NICs in a defined way. So I think maybe we can start with that, I guess. And I'll try and maybe as part of the issue or as part of one of the comment there, I'll try and see if we can come up with maybe a little bit more defined structure to the specification of the VM, and then start from there at least.
The main use case behind that particular requirement is to separate the management and the tenant-facing
data
plane traffic. So, for example, any communication that's happening between services on the SDDC, vSphere, or with the NSX and all those things, that should be completely separate from what services that we are exposing on the cluster itself. Is this because I'm assuming this is something that is common in an anyone deploying a cluster on, let's say, GKE or something where they want to keep that separate. That's the primary motivation behind this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm actually just adding as we speak a simple issue, just to at least I'm going to put it more to start with just the multiple NIC support, and then I guess maybe once in the process of realizing that, we can maybe come up with a little bit more generic way, so that if tomorrow we have to add more specific devices or something to that effect, like you know, basically any virtual device that a VMware can support, for example, we should be able to, in a logical way, we should, in an abstracted way, we should be able to define that in our spec.
One thing I can add to that is, if you guys are looking at the structured way of doing things, then Siddharth, not looking at the prior to 6.5 implementation, but if you look at the Swagger spec for the vAPI, which is becoming the de facto in vCenter, that's a lot more structured, I mean, simpler, and it follows a REST model. So if we can try and follow that, then most of our translation between, let's say, cluster API to vSphere will be much simpler. In fact, I don't know how much backward compatibility are we looking at, let's say, vSphere 6.0 or 5.5 things like that. But if it's something that you can say cluster API is meant to work for 6.7 or later, then even using the right API, basically the vAPI, will make things a lot more simple. And there's already a Swagger spec which models the virtual machines, network, and everything, especially if you're going for a structured model.
Yeah, I mean, so I think as far as version is compared, so I think Locke and we had another discussion about what sort of version we want to support, and I think what we at least sort of loosely agreed to is like maybe 6.5 would be a good start to say, you know what, we're going to start supporting from 6.5 and onwards.
Okay.
I mean, theoretically, the product might work with even the older versions, but you know, since there is going to be a lot of limitations of how much we can test and things like that, so we'll probably start with that.
Yeah. I just posted the vAPI. If you look at the virtual machine, vCenter and virtual machine, the structure is pretty simple. That expresses the, as opposed to the older V model, this one is much more simpler and easy to understand.
I see. Okay.
I mean, what I'm saying is we don't have to reinvent that structure if we have to go that route.
Right.
Okay. Okay. Great discussion. Any other topic anybody would like to introduce or talk about, or questions on any topic that we discussed today? I think if not, then we can just go ahead and call this meeting, call it to a close, bring it to a close. And thanks everybody for coming. Once we have the recording for this, I'll post a link on here, and then we'll be on YouTube. Okay? Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, folks.